Welcome to the deep dive. When we think about the Winter Olympics, the images that spring to mind are usually pristine, spectacular.
Oh, absolutely. The speed of a downhill skier, the grace of a figure skater.
Exactly, the quiet dignity of the torch relay. And there's this enduring idea that the games represent a sacred truce.
A kind of utopian pause.
Yes, a brief pause in global conflict where nations just set aside their differences and celebrate sport. It sounds clean, it sounds pure, and, well, above all, it sounds apolitical.
And that ideal of neutrality is the very first thing our deep dive sources just completely obliterate.
It's a myth.
It's simply a myth, one that's been perpetuated largely by the International Olympic Committee itself. I mean, if you scratch the snow just a little bit, you find that the Winter Games are arguably more politically volatile than their summer counterpart.
Why is that?
Well, precisely because they are smaller, more focused, and historically just so deeply intertwined with the Cold War's fiercest rivalries.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our source material treats the history of the Winter Games not as a series of sporting events, but as, well, a high-stakes geopolitical theater.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So our mission today is to explore how the Winter Games, focusing specifically on the last 75 years of history, corruption, and conflict, have consistently functioned as a proxy battleground, a platform for ideological warfare, and, maybe most critically, a space where state legitimacy is defined.
And what's fascinating here is the unique historical position of the Winter Games' maturation. They officially began in 1924, but they really came of age right in the immediate aftermath of the World Wars.
And their expansion basically mirrored the Cold War.
It mirrored the escalating tensions of the Cold War exactly. This context automatically made the ice rink and the ski slope an arena for contesting global hegemony. Every medal count was viewed as a referendum on which system, capitalism or communism, could produce superior citizens.
So the competition was never just for the gold medal.
Never. It was a race for global propaganda supremacy.
And the political acts start right at the gates, don't they? I mean, even before the first athlete gets on the ice, it's the question of who gets to come in at all.
That's the most fundamental, arguably the most heavy-handed political power the IOC wields. It's the power of recognition. They get to decide which political entities qualify as a nation, which are legitimate, and which ones are, kept outside the global community.
Exactly. And that power is used not just to validate new nations, but just as often to isolate and punish existing ones.
We can track this from the very first post-war games, long before the Cold War really settled in.
Which brings us straight to the 1948 St. Moritz Games. These were marketed as the Games of Renewal after World War II. But if you look at the guest list, you immediately see the political score being settled.
The list was far from inclusive. The IOC, aligning with the victorious Allied powers, explicitly barred both Germany and Japan from even participating.
And this wasn't a decision based on, say, the quality of their bobsled teams.
Not at all. It was a highly visible, punitive diplomatic sanction. The international community, through the machinery of the Olympic movement, was actively reinforcing the new post-war order. It was denying these former Axis powers the platform for international rehabilitation.
By labeling them as pariahs.
By labeling them as pariahs, the IOC was signaling that they were still unfit for the civilized camaraderie of international sport. To be banned is to be publicly shamed.
It's a deep psychological validation of a nation's status, and being denied that is a powerful statement.
Precisely. And then, in contrast, you have the Soviet Union. They certainly weren't banned, but they made a highly calculated decision not to participate in 1948.
And that non-participation is just as politically revealing. So what was the Soviet calculation there? If they weren't banned, why sit out?
This signaled the birth of the Soviet doctrine on international sport. Moscow sent a delegation of exactly 10 observers to St. Moritz. Their mission was basically military-style intelligence gathering.
They weren't there to enjoy the scenery.
Definitely not. They were there to meticulously assess the competitive landscape in every single event, to determine if Soviet athletes could dominate immediately and absolutely.
So they would only enter when victory was assured.
That was the signal. They viewed sport strictly as a mechanism for demonstrating state superiority, a propaganda front. It was a metrics-driven battlefield, not a festival.
That distinction sport as a political tool versus a cultural exchange, it sets up this fundamental division that echoes for decades. And that focus on state legitimacy sets the stage for, well, maybe the most complex diplomatic tangle in Olympic history. the two Chinas issue.
Oh, that's the classic case of the IOC having to referee a sovereignty conflict. The struggle between the Republic of China in Taiwan and the People's Republic of China in Beijing, it all came to a head at the Lake Placid Winter Games in 1980.
Of course, the Moscow summer boycott overshadowed everything else that year, but Lake Placid was the arena for this critical name fight.
And it had been brewing for a while. The PRC had long refused to participate if the ROC was recognized under the name China. This deadlock finally broke in 1979 with something called the Nagoya Resolution.
And what did that resolution do?
The Nagoya Resolution was the IOC formally, caving to Beijing. It recognized the PRC as the sole representative of China.
This wasn't happening in a vacuum, though.
Not at all. It reflected a major shift in global geopolitics. The U.S. and other Western powers were normalizing relations with Beijing, largely as a strategic counterweight to the Soviet Union. The IOC decision just formalized this new reality.
So what did that mean for the team from Taiwan?
The resolution said the ROC team could compete, but only under the name Chinese Taipei. And crucially, without their national flag, anthem, or any symbol suggesting they were a sovereign state.
So when the games opened in Lake Placid, what happened?
Tehran arrived asserting its identity, trying to compete as the Republic of China with its own flag. The IOC, backed by a Swiss court ruling, stood absolutely firm.
So it was a standoff.
A huge standoff right at the Olympic Village. The Taiwanese athletes refused to surrender their national identity, and in retaliation, the IOC just denied them entry credentials.
And the final consequence.
Taiwan withdrew its entire team. It's this remarkable footnote in history. They were the only nation to boycott the 1980 Winter Games, and they did it over a name dispute, not the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
And that incident solidified the Chinese Taipei model we still see today.
It did. It's a perpetual diplomatic compromise, and you see it forced onto the shoulders of the athletes themselves. They are a constant, visible reminder of their contested international status.
But the power of exclusion was also used as a tool of, let's say, moral statecraft, particularly in isolating South Africa.
Yes, the anti-apartheid movement. While the headlines usually focused on the Summer Games, the exclusion of South Africa from the entire Olympic movement was absolutely central to the global effort.
It was a comprehensive cultural and sporting isolation.
It was. The South African National Olympic Committee, SANROC, was expelled from the IOC in 1970. The reason was unambiguous. The regime's refusal to desegregate sport, which ran afoul of the non-discrimination clauses in the Olympic Charter.
And this ban was total, cutting them off for decades.
More than 2 decades. And a key detail here is who was driving this. It wasn't just the Western powers.
Right, who was in the coalition?
It was a powerful coalition led by African nations who threatened mass boycotts, and they were strongly supported by the Soviet bloc. They masterfully used the Olympic Charter's own rules to create this massive political pressure, effectively delegitimizing the Pretoria government on the international cultural stage.
So the isolation became an official tool against institutional racism.
It did. And the resolution took decades. South Africa didn't return until the 1994 Lillehammer Games after the dismantling of apartheid. Their reinstatement was this incredibly powerful symbolic moment, marking their cultural re-entry into the global community.
So the narrative changes dramatically once we get deep into the Cold War. As you mentioned, the Winter Olympics became this proxy battlefield. The medal counts were just metrics of ideological validity.
Every gold medal was proof of the superiority of one system, capitalism or communism, over the other.
And no event embodies this more than the Lake Placid Games of 1980. This wasn't just a sporting competition. It was the intense prelude to the much bigger Moscow summer boycott.
You really have to set the stage here because the tension was palpable. The Games took place just after the December 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The atmosphere wasn't festive, it was a political cauldron.
And the Carter administration was looking for a forceful, non-military response.
And he chose the Olympic movement as his primary target. A mass boycott of the Winter Games wasn't really feasible since they had already started, but they became the platform for the initial U.S. diplomatic offensive.
This is where it gets really direct. What was the specific ultimatum delivered at Lake Placid?
This is a crucial detail that's often forgotten because the hockey game dominates the memory. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was sent to Lake Placid specifically to deliver a message.
He wasn't there for the figure skating.
No. It was there, on the sidelines of the Winter Games, that he formally announced the ultimatum. If Soviet troops did not withdraw from Afghanistan within 1 month, the United States and its allies would boycott the Moscow Summer Olympics.
So the Winter Games became the microphone for U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly. And that political bombshell meant that the entire atmosphere was instantly politicized. Every single event was viewed through the lens of that conflict, and nothing demonstrates that more than the Miracle on Ice.
Right, the men's ice hockey tournament. It transformed from a rivalry into a full-blown clash of civilizations.
On one side, you have the Soviet Red Machine, this monolithic, state-sponsored team of professionalized athletes who were technically listed as soldiers or factory workers.
But were really full-time professionals who had dominated for decades.
For 2 decades. And facing them was the U.S. team, made up of young, amateur college students.
The upset victory was immediately seized upon by Western media. It wasn't just celebrated as an upset.
No, it was framed as a profound moral and ideological vindication. It was interpreted as the triumph of the democratic spirit, of free will, against the regimented, state-sponsored communist system. The propaganda value of that single win vastly outweighed the gold medal itself.
But the Soviet side was never going to let that narrative stand. How did they respond?
They employed a classic counter-narrative strategy. Soviet propaganda downplayed the defeat and instead characterized the Lake Placid Games as a failure of the American system. They highlighted the poor organization, the logistical disasters.
The small town was just completely overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed, and they cited this as evidence of capitalist dysfunction and decay.
And they had a particularly potent, tangible piece of evidence for their case, didn't they?
They absolutely did. They hammered the fact that the brand new purpose-built athlete village was immediately converted into a federal prison for young offenders right after the games.
Which to them was not responsible planning.
To Soviet media, it was stark evidence of economic failure and the harsh, punitive nature of the U.S. police state. It just shows the war of narratives was as intense as the battle on the ice.
Now let's fast forward nearly 4 decades. We see the Winter Games being used for the exact opposite political purpose in 2018. Deliberate diplomatic de-escalation. We're talking about Pyeongchang in South Korea.
That contrast is essential. Pyeongchang occurred during a period of extremely high nuclear tension on the Korean peninsula. The Moon Jae-in administration in South Korea made a strategic decision to use the games to engineer a thaw with Pyongyang.
So the IOC effectively became the geopolitical stage manager for this.
They were critical facilitators. The IOC granted special quota places to ensure North Korea could send 22 athletes, even though most hadn't qualified. This was an explicit political accommodation.
And it allowed North Korea to send a high-ranking delegation.
Including Kim Yo-jong, the powerful sister of Kim Jong-un, which immediately elevated the games to a platform for political dialogue.
The centerpiece, of course, was the unified Korean women's ice hockey team. Internationally, this was hailed as a triumph.
A beautiful show of unity, the Olympic spirit, but on the ground, domestically, it generated significant controversy.
This is a crucial, nuanced insight. For the Moon administration, it was about ethno-nationalism, but for many younger South Koreans.
For them, it was seen as fundamentally unfair.
Unfair how?
The forced inclusion of North Korean players meant several qualified South Korean athletes were displaced from the roster to make room. The younger generation, who are less sentimental about unification, felt the principle of individual fairness was being sacrificed for a political gesture.
So their own athletes' merit was being overlooked for a photo op, essentially.
In their view, yes. It highlighted a generational shift where individual rights and procedural justice outweighed the political goal of national unity.
Beyond the roster, North Korea's delegation brought its own unique political spectacle, the famous Army of Beauties.
The 230-member cheerleading squad. Yes, they were maybe the most visible expression of the cultural chasm. Their performances were rigid, perfectly synchronized, designed to project strength and unity.
But for many watching, it felt different.
It felt bizarre, highly choreographed, and overtly propaganda-heavy, not a genuine gesture of friendship. It underscored how difficult it is to bridge that gap, even with the IOC actively trying to engineer it.
So we've covered sovereignty and ideological proxy wars on the scoreboard, but let's move inside the arena to the judged sports. If a bobsled's time is objective, a figure skater's artistry is subjective, and that has historically made sports like figure skating vulnerable to, well, direct political corruption.
The evidence of political manipulation in judged sports, especially during the Cold War, is overwhelming. Statistical analyses from 1948 to 1989 consistently reveal 2 things: entrenched patriotic bias and aggressive institutionalized bloc voting.
How exactly did this block voting work? Was it just friendly affinity or was it organized?
It was highly organized, almost cartel-like. Judges from the Warsaw Pact nations, the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland operated as a cohesive voting bloc. They consistently scored their own bloc members higher and, conversely, would punish Western athletes with systematically lower scores.
And was there proof these judges were acting on state-level orders?
In many cases, yes. It was institutionalized state policy. Soviet judges weren't independent, they were state employees. Medal acquisition was a non-negotiable state priority, a vital metric of ideological success. This fueled the practice of vote trading.
Describe that mechanism.
It was an open secret. Country A's judge would guarantee a high score for Country B's athlete in pairs, in exchange for Country B's judge supporting Country A's ice dancer later on. The final podium was often determined not by the performance, but by the diplomatic composition of the judging panel.
So the Cold War was literally being fought on 8-inch plates.
In a very real sense, yes. And this structural vulnerability just exploded into a massive public scandal at the Salt Lake City Games in 2002, an event so infamous it was dubbed Skategate.
This was the pairs competition between the Russians, Prizhnaya and Sikulids, and the Canadians, Soleil and Pelletier.
And the performance quality was starkly different. The Russians made a visible technical error, a step out of a jump, a major deduction, while the Canadians skated a flawless, emotionally powerful program.
Yet the Russians won gold on a 5-4 decision, and the voting breakdown was a perfect map of global geopolitics.
A perfect geopolitical divide. The votes for Russia came from Russia, China, Poland, Ukraine, and, pivotally, France. The votes for Canada came from the US, Canada, Germany, and Japan. The French vote was the decider.
And the French judge, Marie-Reine Lagoon, was the key that unlocked the whole scandal.
She was. Lagoon later allegedly confessed she had been pressured by her own federation to vote for the Russians. This was the classic quid pro quo.
What was the trade?
The French Federation wanted a guarantee that the Russian bloc would, in turn, ensure the French ice dance team secured gold later in the competition. Even though she later recanted, the evidence was compelling.
So what did this mean for the IOC? They had to act.
The scandal was catastrophic. The IOC took the extraordinary step of awarding a second set of gold medals to the Canadians, and the fallout was so toxic, it forced the International Skating Union to abolish the entire 6.0 scoring system.
And they replaced it with the hyper-complex code of points, the IJS.
Right. The whole purpose was to objectify scoring, break everything down into mathematical values, and make it transparent and supposedly immune to political whims.
But the new system, intended to eliminate bias, was put to the test at Sochi 2014, and critics argued it failed spectacularly. We're talking about Yoona Kim of South Korea versus Adelina Sotnikova of Russia.
This event showed that the code of points didn't eliminate bias. It just made it harder to trace. Yoona Kim delivered what most agreed was a clean, technically demanding performance. She lost gold to Russia's Sotnikova, who benefited from clear home cooking.
How did the new, supposedly objective system allow for this?
Well, the IJS score is broken into parts. You have the technical score for jumps and the program component score, or PCS, for artistry, which is still subjective. Sotnikova received significantly and surprisingly higher grades of execution and dramatically inflated PCS scores compared to her previous performances.
A sudden surge that was almost universally attributed to nationalistic bias from the panel.
Exactly. The judges were just objectively adding value where it wasn't warranted.
And the composition of the judging panel itself was a huge ethical flag.
Absolutely. The panel included the wife of the general director of the Russian Figure Skating Federation, who was photographed hugging Sotnikova right after the win. Another judge had been previously suspended for trying to fix the 1998 ice dance event.
So the controversy highlighted the core flaw. No matter how mathematical the system, the human element is still susceptible to national loyalty and political pressure.
The system just changed the way the corruption manifested.
The history of the games isn't just what happens on the ice, it's the battles fought in the bid rooms. And that process has become this toxic mix of corruption, bribery, and increasingly outright rejection by democratic populations.
We have to start with the Salt Lake City bid scandal, which preceded Skategate, but revealed this catastrophic rot at the very core of the IOC.
This was the biggest corruption crisis in their history, revealed in 1998. The Salt Lake Organizing Committee systematically bribed IOC members to secure the 2002 games.
And the scale of it was just astonishing, over $1.2 million in illicit payments and benefits. And what made it so insidious was that the bribes were highly personalized, tailored to the specific desires of individual IOC members.
These weren't just envelopes of cash.
No, these were customized services. They included full, all-expenses-paid college scholarships for the children of IOC members. They paid for extensive medical procedures, including cosmetic surgery. There were direct cash payments disguised as consulting fees. It was a complete institutional collapse of ethical standards.
The political and financial fallout was immense.
It was a global shockwave. 10 IOC members were expelled or sanctioned, the first mass expulsion in the organization's history. The U.S. Department of Justice filed 15 charges of bribery and fraud, and critically, it forced the IOC to ban member visits to bid cities to try and sterilize the process.
But the legacy of that corruption, combined with the sheer cost of hosting, Sochi's $51 billion price tag has created a crisis of interest among stable democratic nations.
Which brings us to what we can call the dictator's dilemma during the selection for the 2022 Games. The dilemma was that the cost and demands had become so incompatible with transparent governance that ideal host cities in Europe just withdrew one by one.
It was a parade of withdrawals, wasn't it?
Yes. Munich, Germany, rejected by a local voter referendum. St. Moritz, Switzerland, withdrew. Krakow, Poland saw its bid collapse after 70% of residents voted against it. Stockholm, Sweden pulled out due to a lack of political support. The democratic rejection was systematic.
But the most illuminating collapse was Oslo, Norway. Norway is a wealthy winter sports superpower. They should have been the favorite.
And their bid failed in spectacular fashion. It collapsed entirely after Norwegian media obtained and published the IOC's full 7,000-page manual of demands for the host city.
And the specific requests were just so extravagant.
They were so incompatible with Scandinavian egalitarianism that the government refused the necessary financial guarantees.
What were some of those demands? The sources paint a picture of just pure arrogance.
The demands were truly shocking. Protocol required IOC members to have a cocktail reception with the King of Norway, and the manual explicitly stated the royal family had to pay for it themselves.
You're kidding me?
I am not. For transport, they demanded dedicated, exclusive lanes on all major roads for IOC use. Hotel bars had to stay open extra late, serving only Coca-Cola products. Meeting rooms had to be kept at exactly 20 degrees Celsius. And my personal favorite, IOC members must be greeted with a smile.
Demands that the King of Norway pay for the party and that hotel staff perform happiness. It's no wonder the government said no.
Absolutely. The bid was withdrawn, and this collapse left the IOC with only 2 finalists for the 2022 Games: Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Beijing, China, both autocracies with poor human rights records. Beijing won by just 4 votes. It confirms the movement's increasing reliance on non-democratic regimes.
And we have to acknowledge this pattern of democratic rejection had a foundational precedent set decades earlier in the United States by Denver, Colorado in 1976.
Denver holds a unique and powerful place in Olympic history. The only city ever awarded the Games that subsequently rejected them through democratic action.
They won the bid for the 76 Games in 1970, but it immediately sparked this successful grassroots opposition movement.
A coalition called Citizens for Colorado's Future. Their strategy was brilliant. They put a binding referendum on the state ballot to prohibit the use of any state funds for the Games, effectively starving the organizing committee.
And what were the pillars of their opposition? It wasn't just cost, was it?
Cost was a factor, but it was broader. The first pillar was environmental degradation. They argued the proposed alpine events would permanently scar the fragile Rocky Mountains.
That's a powerful argument in the early days of the environmental movement.
The second was economic liability. The projected cost ballooned from $14 million to over $60 million. Opponents argued this forced taxpayers to assume massive, uncontrolled liability.
And the third, the quality of life argument.
This was perhaps the most relatable. The CCF popularized the fear of Californication, unchecked urban sprawl, and massive population growth that residents felt would destroy the unique character of Colorado.
The result was definitive.
A landslide. The referendum passed with 60% of the vote, forcing Denver to surrender the Games. They were hastily reassigned to Innsbruck. It remains a foundational case study, proving that local democracy can indeed check the ambition of the global sporting establishment. The modern era of the Winter Games has seen the escalation of political conflict using highly sophisticated new tools. We move beyond simple boycotts to the weaponization of human rights legislation, global anti-doping rules, and even basic credentials like visas.
And Sochi 2014 was an absolute convergence point for every major issue facing the Olympic movement. We know it was the most expensive Olympics at $51 billion, but the corruption was systemic.
It was a state project that critics allege was a cover for massive embezzlement. Opposition leader Boris Nemtsov alleged that up to $30 billion was embezzled. He documented how vast contracts were awarded to President Putin's inner circle, like the Rotenberg brothers, without competitive bidding.
His claim was that the games were primarily a mechanism to distribute state wealth
and consolidate loyalty to the regime, with sport as a secondary purpose.
On top of that internal corruption was the enormous external diplomatic protest over Russia's human rights record, specifically the 2013 gay propaganda law.
That legislation sparked a massive global outcry, positioning the Games as a battleground for LGBTQ+ rights. Western leaders used their attendance, or lack thereof, as a diplomatic weapon. Obama, Gauck, Holland, they all declined to attend the opening ceremony as a deliberate snub.
And the U.S. sent an even more symbolic and direct message.
They did. The official U.S. delegation included openly gay athletes like Billie Jean King and Brian Boitano. It was a powerful, non-athletic statement delivered right into the heart of the host nation's policy.
And while the IOC tried to ignore it, this pressure did lead to a concrete long-term change.
It did. The controversy eventually forced the IOC to add specific anti-discrimination clauses regarding sexual orientation to all future host city contracts. It's an example of how the Games can be leveraged to affect incremental policy change.
But the most shocking revelation from Sochi was the systematic state-sponsored doping operation.
This is where the story turns into almost cinematic espionage. The fallout proved Russia's doping was a sophisticated conspiracy operated by the Ministry of Sport and, critically, the FSB, the Secret Service.
How sophisticated was this, really?
It was a logistical marvel of cheating. The sources detail a scheme where FSB agents drilled tiny mouse holes in the walls of the anti-doping lab.
A Secret Service operation dedicated to swapping urine samples.
Exactly. Covertly swapping tainted samples for clean ones in the dead of night. It was an institutional commitment to cheating at the highest level.
The fallout from that led to the IOC and JODA trying this delicate balancing act, punishing the state without entirely excluding the athletes. This created what we can call shadow nations.
The evolution of the neutral athlete. It's an exercise in nomenclature management, trying to strip the Russian state of its symbols without emptying the stadiums of its talent.
So in Pyeongchang 2018, what was the status?
Russia was banned, but athletes competed as Olympic athletes from Russia, or OAR. They used the Olympic flag and anthem.
By Beijing 2022, that changed again.
It shifted to the Russian Olympic Committee, or ROC, again, flag and anthem banned, but they were permitted to use Tchaikovsky's music instead of the national anthem.
And for the upcoming Milano Cortina 2026 Games,
the status has been tightened again to individual neutral athletes, or AIN. This is the strictest yet. Intense vetting, no teams, no officials. They'll compete under a specialized AIN flag and anthem.
This system is constantly criticized for allowing Russia to maintain its status while technically being banned. The penalty is seen as insufficient.
That's the core criticism. It provides the appearance of punishment without the substance of a complete ban. And for 2026, it's further complicated because Belarusian athletes are also included as ANs, due to Belarus's support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So the neutral designation can't strip away the profound political context of their presence?
Not at all. They are shadows of their sanctioned states, and their participation ensures the Games remain politicized.
Finally, let's talk about how the fundamental logistics granting credentials and visas have become a direct diplomatic lever.
The operational aspect, which should be administrative, has been fully weaponized. The deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations has led to reciprocal visa denials. In the lead-up to Sochi, Russia expelled U.S. journalist David Satter, the first expulsion of an American journalist since the Cold War.
A direct signal that the Kremlin was controlling the narrative.
And the U.S. has responded in kind, denying visas to Russian journalists, citing them as propaganda agents. This cycle creates a dangerous threat to press freedom. Russia has explicitly warned it will retaliate against Western media for the 2026 cycle if restrictions continue.
So it politicizes who gets to cover the Games and ultimately who gets to tell the story. Hashtag outro the continuing fracture.
What's fascinating here, as we step back, is the realization that the Winter Games are not a passive mirror reflecting geopolitics. They are an active, strategic participant in shaping it. And when we review this history, three long-term trends really stand out.
First, we see the definitive shift to diplomatic boycotts. The sources show that total athletic boycotts, like in 1980, harmed athletes more than they changed policy. The modern trend official stay home, athletes compete, allows nations to signal virtue without sacrificing sporting prestige.
Second, there's the undeniable crisis of democratic hosting. The toxic combination of the IOC's history of corruption from the Salt Lake scandal and its arrogance exposed by the Oslo demands has systematically driven the Games away from accountable democracies.
Which forces the movement toward authoritarian hosts, creating a feedback loop where the Games become more controversial just because of where they're held.
Exactly. And third, the persistence of bias remains a major structural problem. Whether it was bloc voting in the Cold War or the home cooking in Sochi, the subjectivity of judged sports is a fundamental vulnerability that no complex scoring system has managed to fully eliminate.
So, what does this all mean for us now? The complexity and the tumultuous history we've detailed today show us that the Olympics are perhaps the highest expression of non-military statecraft. The competition for legitimacy and ideological supremacy often eclipses the athletic competition itself. The podium is rarely, if ever, apolitical.
And we can project this forward immediately. The continuing, evolving status of individual neutral athletes, including both Russians and Belarusians, ensures that the Milano Cortina 2026 Games will remain deeply embedded in the politics of the Russo-Ukrainian War. It continues the tradition.
So here's a final provocative thought for your own deep dive. If this current trajectory continues, if only autocracies remain willing to foot the bill and ignore the organizational demands, how might the increasing isolation of democracies from hosting fundamentally change the ethical character and ultimately the global legitimacy of the Olympic movement going forward?